Good to know what we're going to be doing. For the next 3 days, from 8:30 to 9, please come, sign in. You now know where DeGrace is if you've never been here before. There will be coffee and a few snacks, so be ready to go at 9. Each morning from 9 until about 9:30, I'll do a little introduction to set the stage for the day, and also on tomorrow and Wednesday, recap if there were any questions or carry on the conversation just so there's some continuity between the lectures as we go. So sign in, introduction. You'll have 2 lectures. There's going to be a short break from 10:30 to 10:45. From 10:45 to 12 is when we're going to assign the small groups that you'll be discussing and meeting with from 1 to 3. Now you will have a new facilitator each day, I believe. And we are in the process of regrouping those because there were about 10 people who signed up over the weekend after we had broken them into groups. So we're going to redo that. So before you leave for lunch today, be sure that you know what room you're going to and who your facilitator is. And then I will give someone from that group the sign-in sheet for the afternoon. If you can make sure that your facilitator checks everybody in, and then if you can bring that back to me tomorrow, attendance is mandatory. All right, and everyone knows where Sears is, right? Yes? If you are not sure where Sears is, please let me know, and I will give you directions. Okay, so this is a great question. Why are we here? Who's here because someone was like, you need to do this to graduate? I mean, let's be honest, right? You're like, yeah. Beyond that, that's what it is. Well, to get a little more specific, because that's generally not accepted when we create courses and things like that, the official reason why you're here is to introduce and review research integrity topics and issues, provide you with resources such as rules, regulations, and people. I feel that they are the best resource, and you need to know if you have a question who to go to or who to call, and at least they can be the next step to direct you on. And then give you an opportunity to discuss cases in the gray. Again, you're all involved in science, which asks questions because we don't know. So we're constantly pushing boundaries, and this deals with issues of ethics and research integrity. And so these in the gray doesn't necessarily mean we have a wonderful black and white rule for you to follow. There's always going to be some uncertainty, and that's your opportunity today and in the small group sessions to really work through those and say, it seems pretty clear cut, but as you know in your professional career, these are going to come up and you're going to have to deal with them. All right. So this is why you're really here. I'm going to go through a case example of something that has impacted me when I was doing lectures and creating these things about research integrity. And it struck home because I was working in a lab at the time. So imagine you join a lab. Is this a stretch for anyone? You're working towards your degree and you like your mentor. So sometimes we just click with people, right? It's a good environment and this person is extremely encouraging. You just work together, all right? They have similar views. You don't always agree on everything, but they're just great. You go to, their holiday parties, they have this thing, they're very welcoming, you sit down, they make time for you. I mean, you looked around at labs and you decided on this one, and imagine that you just got lucky, all right? This was a great person, it's a great environment, it's prestigious, you're just excited about it. A year, maybe 2 goes by, and you're becoming frustrated with the results of your particular experiment. You can't replicate earlier lab observations, and so you go and you speak to the PI and the mentor, and they're very understanding. She is encouraging and even offers you an opportunity to review pages of a grant application that she just sent in and see if you would be interested in a new project. So just imagine, has anyone ever been frustrated with how things are going? That they're not getting the results, they can't replicate it. Despite this, they're like, do you want to try a new project? And they give you this. And there's a problem with the opportunity. So the grant says that there are a couple figures that are resulting from unpublished data, but you know for a fact that this data was actually in a published paper the year before. So you read this over after you leave her office and you speak with another colleague who is working very closely on this project with her regarding the grant application, and you discover additional problems. So in this grant, it lists that this other colleague of yours had done these experiments, and it's just not true. He's beginning to freak out because he's like, I never did those. I never did those. These figures are manipulated. And again, this problem of these results that they claim are unpublished, but you were on that paper, that your colleague was. So basically, you're freaking out. Everyone kind of recognize that there's an issue here. I mean, this is not something that you need a thou shall not, state that data is unpublished and then put it in a grant application, right? We know this, right? Please, everyone just nod. Say yes. Thank you. All right, so this is something that you probably know is wrong, all right? And yet, what do if you're in that situation? Anyone have a recommendation? Be realistic. You like this person. You have a really good working relationship. Nothing?
Point it out,
ask her. All right, you seek advice. And a close advisor, it ends up being that, actually it's one of the lab people, they were dating someone and they asked that advisor, and then someone from a that was used to work in the lab but had graduated. So they basically asked them and they're like, you need to go talk to her. Who said that, sorry? That's all right, don't need to. You need to go talk to her, all right? I mean, this could be a problem, and go see what she says. So you make an appointment, you're waiting outside her office, and basically you're a little nervous, right? Because this is a difficult situation. She denies copying the image, but all of a sudden, like in this interview, she starts saying like, oh, I fucked up. Sorry about that. Literally, this is a quote from the article. So this is a little like, okay, I still feel like nothing's really resolved, all right? You went to the meeting, you told her about this. She denied all this. She was like, oh, this didn't happen. This, but I screwed up. So you still kind of don't know what to do. But obviously, labs are really hard to keep secrets in, right? I mean, you work together. You obviously have talked to this. So rumors are going around the lab that this PI sets up. And basically, people are like, okay, this is going to affect everyone here. So you round everyone up, you go to a meeting, and you do it off campus because you'd like to have some privacy and not really have someone walk in on you. So you go off campus, maybe just the Starbucks, and you talk about this, about what happened. You all realize that this is a pretty serious situation, and you really have no idea how things are going to result, how it's going to end up. And so let me just pause for a second here and think about all the things that you've done to get to the point that you're at right now. All right, so think about vacations that you've missed, or things in your personal life that you've delayed, how hard you've worked, other opportunities that you've just kind of put on hold because you were pursuing this. All right, either your degree or this opportunity, and you're a little frustrated. So you go back to the PI. And this time, she asks for forgiveness. She says, I'm so sorry. She says, you did a wonderful job. You pushed this issue. This is absolutely what you should have done. And basically, she states that this grant application probably wasn't going to get funded. But what I'll do is I'll send an email, and I'll CC you on it. And I'll send this to NIH and state that there were some problems with the application. So basically, she's just kind of withdrawing it. So you're feeling pretty good right now. However, you just had that meeting with your fellow lab, and some of them are not just okay with how this resulted. So another member of your lab meets with the PI, and she says, listen, I'm going to a different lab. This is just unacceptable what you did. You submitted this grant application with figures that were already published, and I'm leaving. So at this time, the PI starts to give further explanations, and it just turns out to be extremely awkward for the next couple of weeks and months. And you, as a group, decide not to alert the university unless everyone in the lab agrees. So it has to be kind of unanimous. And again, just a really tense working environment. And then a couple months go by, nothing really changes, and you meet again, and you basically decide to report. And the reason is that you feel that this could happen again. And so your biggest worry was that if you didn't turn her in, different grad students would be stuck in your position, all right? And you basically had an awful, awful experience with this, and you wouldn't want to force this on anyone else. So you report it, you go to one of the deans, and the university's response is by the book, all right? They follow everything officially, they have all these guidelines, they go through an informal investigation where they have different faculty involved to meet with the students, to meet with the players, and their results are basically like, we do need a formal investigation. So they have a formal investigation, again, by 3 different faculty members. They end up reporting out to the Office of Research Integrity at the time. It's now OHRP. No, different name? Oh, it's still ORA. Sorry, Office of Research Integrity. You end up having to notify the granting agencies that she received grants for, and notifying journals and co-authors of papers that she's published recently. During this time, she also officially resigns. And so here you are. Now, of course, there are privacy rules when these investigations occur. And despite the fact that you didn't really talk about it, you still are pretty isolated as a group. So despite the fact that you're not supposed to say anything, there are still rumors going around. There are still things that saying, listen, it was her students that turned her in. You ask some faculty members that you respect, and they're like, listen, I don't know if you guys do the right thing. It's a really difficult situation. The funding that has been returned, the $1.8 million, also funded all of your research. So the university has scrambled so that you can continue to work and get paid so that you're not just out of a job. But this was something that was never really addressed prior to this. At the end, when this happens, they then have to review all of your thesis work. All right, so you've been there. Some members of your group have been there 6 to 7 years working on their PhDs. And the evaluation out of the 6 of you that worked in their lab, 1 of you can continue on the project that you were working on for your PhD, but you would have to transfer, obviously, to a different group, and you could still do it, but you're in a new situation. One of you basically is like, I'm done, I'm going to law school. One says, I'm out of science, I want to go to business school, maybe, hasn't gone yet. And 3 other have to start their PhD programs over at a different university. Now, the reason is that a lot of this information that they used to generate their PhD proposals didn't meet the standards of what you were supposed to accomplish as a PhD program. All right? Now, when this came out, this was in 2006, and it's called Truth and Consequences. Literally, I just gave you the summary of this article. So this is, of course, one version of the story. I mean, please understand that this was one article, one version of the story. It was in 2006, several months after this, about a year after it happened. But you can always check it out. One of the things that happened is, of course, in an article you publish this, and then you have an opportunity to submit responses. And the first response that's listed up there is from another PhD student who graduated from the same university. And they were just appalled. They said, listen, I went to that university, and I'm just shocked because it's not this one individual that let these students down. Where was everybody else? Some of them were there 6 to 7 years and they hadn't published yet. Where was the different review committees, and how was it that no one saw that they weren't making progress with their research? And then another one had a comment about, listen, we protected and were there for the students during the reporting process, and the university did a very good job of counseling them. But there were some problems with, this funding idea. No one had considered what to do with the students if the funding was pulled, and they kind of scrambled and made these last-minute kind of arrangements. But what happens to them, and what about, their reputation and all these different things? So I tell you this story because it is a good example. But right now you're in the situation most like the graduate students, right? But that's not always going to be the case. At some time you're going to progress in your career, and you will be in the position of the responsible investigator or the mentor. And you will be faced with the pressures of publishing and submitting grants and getting money and furthering your research, and you're going to work within a university. Now, I don't make any claim that this course for the next 3 days would solve all of these problems, or if only the PI had attended something like this, she never would have done what she did. The idea behind this is that we want to give you an opportunity to hear about some of these issues that do come up, all right? These are occurrences that happen. I mean, these situations are awful. They're not always this extreme, but they happen and they have really bad consequences. Who's in basic science research? Okay. For basic science research, 1/3 to 1/2, and this is kind of an average, of the reporting for scientific misconduct is brought up by graduate students and postdocs, all right, because you're aware of them, all right? You see them, and what we're trying to do is give you some basic knowledge, give you a foundation, so that even if you never do human subject research, if you hear about something and you don't think it's right, you know who to go to and who to talk to, all right? Because we're kind of all in this together in the university, and we want to make sure that as a reputation for the university, we're doing appropriate research. Any questions? Okay. The other thing is that there are going to be issues that you're going to run into, and this afternoon we'd like to give you the opportunity to talk those out. So we have obviously the cases that you assign, but if there's something else, this is an opportunity. You may have something, but you may not. All right. So, excellent. I'm going to introduce the first speaker, who is Tracy Wilson Holden, and switch off with the mic. That clips on, please. Okay, good.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. So good morning. As Nicole said, my name is Tracy Wilson Holden. I am the Director of Research Integrity and Education here at the university, and so that encompasses 2 different areas. I do education like this, excuse me, where my job is to come out and talk to students. I also do presentations to faculty and staff here at the university, talking about primarily research misconduct, but also lots of other areas that folks might consider to be research misconduct at some point. So that's the first half of what I do. The other half of what I do is the integrity piece, which is I serve as the Research Integrity Officer for the university, and my job with that is to investigate allegations of research misconduct that occur here at the institution. That would be against graduate students, that would be against undergraduate students, staff members, or faculty members. And so I much prefer to come out and help you all get on the right path so that I never have to see you wearing my other hat. The education side is a much more pleasant interaction. All right, so I'll start out with an enjoyable cartoon that I'm sure you've all seen before. One of the things I'd like to do, I want to get you guys off on not just sitting here looking at me for an hour. So let's think about this. We've all heard the term research misconduct, right? And if you know the absolute formal definition, then just stay silent if you would. But can you give me some ideas? Give me an example of what you think research misconduct might be. The case study that Professor Deming talked about is obviously one of those things where there was a claim in a manuscript that an actual published figure was from unpublished data. But give me another example. What would you consider to be research misconduct? When you think about the terminology, what do you think of? I started 10 minutes early, so I can stand here quiet for 10 minutes if you want. Go ahead.
For me, it would be like trying to enroll somebody when they don't make the inclusion criteria just to get the numbers, so it doesn't, if I'm not being honest with the patient about what are the rates and benefits from the study just for my own benefit, just like, So
Okay.
consider that
Okay, so enrolling someone in a study when they don't actually meet the inclusion criteria? Okay. What else? Go ahead. Misrepresenting or changing data or results. Great. Tell me some more. What else do you think? Plagiarism. Say it again. Plagiarism? Okay. Tell me what you think about that. What's plagiarism? My third graders can tell you what plagiarism is. Come on, I know you guys can. Go ahead.
Copying somebody else's words, written words, or should be data.
Great, right. So it goes beyond just copying someone's words, right? My 9-year-old twins will say that they can't copy someone else's answers off of their test who's sitting next to them, right? But we know, actually we should know, as it gets more intense and as your career progresses, that plagiarism can actually include a lot more things than just copying a direct paragraph or a sentence from one place to another. There are lots of other components to plagiarism, which includes the idea of copying someone's ideas, their methods, as well as their words. Do we have any other ideas on what might be construed as research misconduct? Go ahead, in the back.
Using a reagent you know is bad if you think it'll give you a different result than using a good reagent.
Okay. So saying that it's something else? Or just using one that you know is going to give you? Okay. All right, good. Have you guys come across these kinds of situations? With show of hands, anybody seen any of this stuff that we just talked about? Yeah? All right, some of you. Did you have another idea on what misconduct? Claiming to have done things that you didn't actually do. Okay, great. All right, so would it be research misconduct, do you think, for a student to take all the data with them when they leave and not leave either the originals or copies with the PI when they leave the institution? Is that research misconduct? Show of hands, is it research misconduct? Yes. Okay. All right. Would the PI be committing research misconduct if they're holding back on publishing the graduate student's work? So say the PhD student or the master's student graduates and they've done all this great work and they worked on a paper, but now they're gone from the institution and they keep calling the PI, they keep contacting them, and he keeps saying, oh no, we're not ready to publish. Oh no, we're not ready to publish. So the PI is actually holding back the data and won't submit for publication. And you, as an ex-graduate student, are sort of out of the loop, right? No power to make it get published. Is that research misconduct? Do you think the PI is committing research misconduct? Show of hands, yes. No, maybe wiggling hands. I'm not sure what that would be. All right, good. So this is just sort of to get you into the idea of thinking about the fact that we have lots of ideas about bad behavior, right? But I'm not sure that all of those things might be research misconduct in the end. And so let's actually get into what is research misconduct. And you guys you didn't do too badly. You were pretty darn close. The actual definition of research misconduct is fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reviewing research or in reporting research results. So lots of different factors there, right? It's not just reporting research results, but it's also in proposing them, performing them, or reviewing. The second half of that says research misconduct does not include honest error or difference of opinion. So we let you make a mistake, right? Mistakes are okay. We try not to do that, but mistakes are okay. That's not research misconduct. So taking those definitions a little bit further, then the federal, our local policy and the federal policy actually defines each of the three different components of research misconduct. So fabrication is actually making up data or results and then recording or reporting them. So that would be something like creating patients that don't exist. so that you can meet enrollment numbers. So you just kind of fabricate, you make up some patients, and you give them some numbers. So that's fabricating data. Or if you write down the results of something and you actually haven't done an experiment to go along with those results, they're not real. Contrast that with falsification, which is manipulating research materials, equipment processes, or changing or omitting data or results so that the research isn't accurately represented. Okay? Some examples of that. So also bad, right? But a little bit different than fabrication, where you're actually making stuff up. And one of the things that I like to point out in the definition of falsification is that the omission of data is also falsification. So it's kind of like the IRS. Just because you didn't know or just because you don't include it doesn't mean that you didn't do something wrong. So a lack of something that ought to be there is as bad as putting in something that doesn't belong or that you didn't actually do. Another example of falsification would be mislabeling a sample. So in the example that Professor Deming gave this morning, where there was a misrepresentation of a figure that was actually from a published article, but they were calling it, the PI was saying that this was unpublished data. Another example of that might be showing a picture of some cells and saying that they're mouse cells, when in reality, those are rat cells or they're some other kind of animal cells. Yes, you have a question?
If you don't include an outlier, but mentioning in your paper saying that this is outdated, that was it maybe not outdated?
If you include the fact that you got that there were results, and if you have a good explanation for why you don't include those, then that's okay. If you simply get 3 or 4 sets of results that would make your argument not strong enough to publish, or that misrepresents what you actually found by excluding that data, then that's a problem. But yes, really when you tell the reader what they need to know, and there's not any attempt to deceive, then you're in a much better position. Okay? And then the final aspect, so we have the 3 components of research misconduct: falsification, fabrication, and the final one is plagiarism. We've talked about this a little bit already. So it's the appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, words, or results without giving appropriate credit. So that would be copying another's words into a grant application or a manuscript. And in general, it kind of goes back to what I was talking about before, allowing the reader to believe something that isn't true. So in this instance with plagiarism, it's allowing the reader to believe that an idea or a process was actually your original idea when it came from someone else, really. All right. So that's what it is. And it's defined in these two in several different places. And really, everybody uses pretty much the exact same definition of research misconduct. Our local policy is in the faculty handbook, and it's called the Policy for Responding to Allegations of Research Misconduct. And it lays out the entire process by which we follow whenever an allegation of research misconduct comes up. It mirrors the federal policies. So PHS-funded studies, that's Public Health Service-funded studies, are generally reviewed through the Office of Research Integrity, which is a federal agency, and they have pretty much 2 goals: to investigate research misconduct allegations, and then also to educate in the responsible conduct in research. That's their job. That's what they do. And that would be NIH funding, which is, I think, the reason you're all here. You're all funded by NIH, right? Or working in a lab that has NIH funding. So all of the research that you all do would be under the guidelines of the Office of Research Integrity's policies on research misconduct. One of the other big ones that we also have to keep an eye on is National Science Foundation funded studies. Those policies are essentially exactly the same. They're just found in a different location in the Federal Register. But the definition of research misconduct, the essential process that we would need to follow, is pretty much the same for any of the funded research. And let me make a comment here in that when there is federal funding involved in research, we are required to report to those federal agencies whenever we find a problem at some point or other. Whenever we're sure there's a problem that we really need to look into, then we need to report to the federal agencies. But we have our local policy in the instance that there is no funding at all. It's still not okay to do research misconduct here at this institution and really at any institution, even if there's no federal funding involved. So we have a lot of different situations. Most of you guys who are working in biomedical laboratories are funded in some way or another. But say you have industry funding, but you're working under the auspices of Case Western Reserve University. That work is still under the local policy for research misconduct, and it's still held to the same standards. So whether, or someone's master's thesis that isn't funded, if they're doing research, it's still going to be reviewed under a policy. So how does this whole process work? So what happens if an individual comes up with an allegation of research misconduct? They think something's going on, and they're not sure whether or not something bad has occurred, or they know something bad has occurred, but they need to push it forward. So that what that individual would do would be to submit an allegation of research misconduct to the research integrity officer, and that's me here at Case. And the first step of what I would do, and again, this, as Professor Deming said this morning, this is always a bad situation, right? There's generally not a good outcome for anybody, even if the person is doing absolutely the right thing. And so we take the process very slowly, which can be frustrating at times, but we do it for a reason. We have a 3-step process, and there are sort of exits at each of the individual steps. So that I look at it first as a preliminary assessment. I'm going to make a determination of whether or not it could meet the definition of research misconduct. My job is not to say whether research misconduct occurred or not, but to determine whether or not it has the potential to fall under that definition, right? So as we were talking about before, things like if someone comes to me and says, there was an author on the paper that didn't belong. He didn't do any of the work, he didn't write the paper, and he's an author on it. That's not falsification, that's not fabrication, that can't be plagiarism. That's what we would call just an authorship dispute, and I think you're going to hear about those this afternoon. But it can't fall under the definition of research misconduct unless there's some other component there. So unless there's a fabrication or a falsification component as well. A simple authorship dispute, well, never simple, doesn't fall under the definition of research misconduct. So that might be something that at the preliminary assessment level, I would refer that to the appropriate people to handle that situation. It's not like if it's not research misconduct, it doesn't count at all. We have processes to deal with all of these other bad behaviors that don't meet the definition, but it might not be through my policy or my office that it's reviewed. So I have the ability at the preliminary assessment level to say, I don't think this doesn't have the potential to be research misconduct. And so I would refer that off at that stage. Yes?
Do you ever randomly just check to see if there's wrongdoing in the laboratory?
We do not have an auditing process for research misconduct. There are lots of other random audits that occur. So if you're using animals in your research, the IACUC, the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, does random audits. If you're doing human subjects research, any of the institutional review boards that reviews human subjects research, they all do random audits. And we call them quality improvement analyses, actually. So the goal is not necessarily punitive to find problems, but to identify situations where something isn't being done exactly correctly, and then to work on a way of rectifying that and making sure that we're in compliance. So I'm pretty sure that, what is it called now? EHS, I think, Environmental Health and Safety. It used to be DOES. They also do random auditing. So not within my process.
So why is that?
Why is that? Because there are no parameters around the research over which research misconduct can occur. So if you talk about human subjects research, that's only instances where human subjects are involved in research. And if it's animal research, then that only involves use with animals. I can be called in on anything having to do with research, even if it's something out of anthropology or mathematics where there's research involved, any of the biomedical laboratories, any of the clinical trials areas. And I actually don't have a full listing of all the research that's done here at the institution. And again, it's funded and unfunded, right? So if someone's just doing some research in the psychology department without any funding, that still falls under the policy. But I don't have a running list of every single research project that exists at this institution. So we do count on the people involved in the research. And there's a lot of overlap. So there are frequently animals involved, or there are frequently humans involved, or other processes involved where there would be some random auditing that would occur. Does that answer your question? Okay. All right. So the preliminary assessment is something that I handle at my level. If I find that it could potentially meet the definition of research misconduct, I'm going to ask our deciding official, who is the actual decision maker and sends out the report that says we're going to move this forward based on my recommendation. If we think that there's a potential for it to meet the definition of research misconduct, we'll move forward to an inquiry phase. And again, the process here at the middle stage is not to make a determination of whether or not someone has committed research misconduct, but only to determine if there's enough evidence to investigate. So they're going to do, and we put together a faculty committee at this point. So I take off my decision-making hat, and I'm a facilitator then at that point. As I said, this can involve any kind of research done at the institution at all. And clearly, I'm not going to be expert enough to review the actual science involved in every single scientific thing that occurs here, or every research thing that occurs here at this institution. So I put together a panel of people who do have that expertise on that particular project, as well as some others. So we always have to have at least one or two people who have a good scientific background in being able to look at the waveforms or the pictures that are presented or the raw data that's included in that allegation and be able to evaluate the science involved there, as well as some others on the committee who are just there to look at the overall picture of what's going on. So their job then is to determine whether or not there's enough evidence to investigate, and they can make a determination again, just like at the preliminary assessment, this is something else, it can't be research misconduct, or I think we need to look at this further because it might potentially be research misconduct. So again, there's a way to get out without it necessarily going all the way to an investigation of misconduct. And then obviously the final step is a true serious investigation to figure out whether or not misconduct occurred. Well, then what happens? Or how would we make this determination of whether or not misconduct occurred? Basically, three components. It needs to be a significant departure from the accepted practices, and this is important. It says of the relevant research community. So we're not holding every single piece of science to the exact same standards, because I think you probably all know, even within the biomedical realm, that the standards are different. What is expected in one kind of research it may not be exactly the same as what's expected in another kind of research. We always know that you're not allowed to make stuff up, you're not allowed to change results, you're not allowed to plagiarize, right? That's not what I mean. But just as the gentleman before said, well, what if I write in the paper that I didn't include that because I thought that it was contaminated or something, and that's why I didn't include that outlier. Well, perhaps that's acceptable in one arena of research, while in another, depending on the kind of science that it is, that would be completely unacceptable, even if you wrote it, right? So we look at the relevant research community to make some determinations about what's acceptable and what isn't. And that's, again, why we need those scientific experts from those particular fields to look at the information. It needs to be committed intentionally, knowingly, and or recklessly. It can be one of those, it can be two, it can be all three. Intentional, knowing, reckless. And we always debate what those mean. It seems like in every in every instance where we're having an actual research misconduct process and we get to the point of trying to make a determination, the committee needs to determine whether or not it was committed intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly. And there are always debates about what these definitions mean. And it really is meant to be up to the committee to decide what they think. You know, and again, it goes back to the idea that a mistake is okay. But being reckless isn't, right? If your mistake is completely reckless because you just weren't paying attention or because there weren't good processes in place to check and make sure that mistakes weren't made, well, that might be considered to be reckless in that particular situation. So that's a determination that needs to be made by the committee. And then finally, it needs to be proven by a preponderance of evidence. So this is not a court of law. It doesn't need to be a shadow, you know, beyond a shadow of a doubt. It only needs to be a preponderance of the evidence, and we actually do define that as essentially more sure than not, right? It needs to be greater than 50% likely that the fact is more true than it probably isn't true. And that's obviously a lower standard than a court of law, right? But we also recognize that in these situations, there may not be exhibit A, B, C, and D, which absolutely proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that something occurred or didn't occur. Okay? Well, so what happens? What does this all mean? So we talk about this research misconduct, and in the example that you were given this morning, that the PI resigned from the institution. But there are really a lot of different things that can occur. So the deciding official would implement the sanctions or work with others, because oftentimes there would need to be a dean or a department chair involved in some of the sanctions that would be determined to be necessary if a person was found to have committed misconduct. Obviously, in some very egregious cases, there may be a separation from the institution, right? So if it's a student, they may get kicked out and not be able to finish their degree. If it's a faculty member, there's the potential that they could lose their tenure, or if they're not tenured yet, they could be let go, right? A staff member can be fired, potentially. But then there are plenty of other sanctions that maybe don't reach that level, where perhaps monitoring or probation or a suspension might be what is recommended. And again, with students, it might be a separation from the program. So that's what we do here at Case Western Reserve University. But again, if there's federal funding involved, we're not the only ones who have a say in what happens. And so the federal agencies then can implement additional sanctions, which can include what they call debarment from receiving federal funding. Often, one of ORI's, that's the Office of Research Integrity's, one of their typical sanctions would be that the individual is not allowed to receive federal funding, they're not allowed to sit on a review committee, they're not allowed to be involved, even as a key personnel or anything else, in any research that's funded by their agency. And they will often do that for a period of 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. In some really awful cases, they will debar a person for life. They are never allowed to apply for funding or be involved in funding from that agency again. And they generally seek out for the people to sign what they call voluntary exclusion agreements. And so the person essentially says, okay, I agree that I won't apply. I agree that I won't be involved in research funded by your agency. Well, does it happen here? It does. I wouldn't have a job otherwise, I guess. So I get probably, and it really varies year to year, I probably get somewhere in the range of 5 or so folks who come to me a year. And sometimes it's 10, and sometimes it's 3. You know, it really is pretty dependent on the year, and I never know who's going to walk in my door and what story they're going to tell me. And again, I think research misconduct is one of the areas where, you know, folks just automatically go there in their minds, right? If something just feels bad, you know something is going on that's not right. You know, you can feel it. There's just that sense that what's happening is not the way it's supposed to happen. Again, that doesn't always mean it's research misconduct, right? But it seems that I'm the one person at the university who people will come to see, regardless of what the issue is. They just know something's wrong, and so I'm available to talk with people and try to get them headed in the right direction. And so I see lots of authorship disputes, and I refer those folks to the right course of action. A lot of data management issues, and let me just make this statement since I have a captive audience, and this is one of the things that occurs with unfortunately great regularity here at the institution, and I really think it's across the board. It's not just Case Western Reserve University, it's everywhere. All original data is meant to reside with the principal investigator at the institution that funded the research. As a student, you have the right to take copies of data with you and use them in agreement with your PI. Your PI is not allowed to say you can't take anything and you can't ever use anything. You were part of that research, right? So you can take copies with you. You, however, must leave the originals here. We as an institution are required, misconduct or not, it could be something in the financial realm even. We are required to maintain data and records associated with funded research for a period of years following the end of that research. And it is an absolute requirement of the institution for the students to make sure that the data remains here and for the PIs to make sure that they have the copies of the data before they let their students leave. While that's very clear-cut and it sounds obvious, that's not always what happens. And so often we see issues of data management difficulties where both of those things can occur. The PI doesn't want to give the student copies to take with them, or the student takes the data with them and the PI doesn't find out about it until a year later or 6 months later. And then they come to see me and they say, the student took all the data. And I say to them, why didn't you make sure the student left the data before they left? Because it's really a joint, it's an equal responsibility. You all as students and postdocs and graduate students and PhD students need to know that the data needs to stay here. Your PI, on the other hand, also needs to know that they need to have a copy of, or they need the originals before you leave. So that's one of the really big and sticky situations that occurs. And it's not always research misconduct by any stretch of the imagination, but it's one of those continuing issues that I see over and over again. The other is mentoring issues. And if any of you have heard me talk on these topics before, my standard statement is there are no bad mentors, there are no bad mentees, there are just really bad mentoring relationships that occasionally occur. And those can lead in all sorts of directions, right? Professor Deming described that perfect situation where you click with your advisor, you click with your mentor, you click with your PI, you guys work well together as a group. On the other hand, I think that that's, I don't know if that's the rare instance or if it's the small majority, but there are plenty of situations where the mentor and the person who is working with them do not see eye to eye on lots of different things. And that's not necessarily research misconduct either. It can turn into research misconduct, though, if the mentoring relationship is bad for that long. So if you can't go to your PI and you can't say, I can't get this data. I've tried everything. Can you, I need something, some advice, some help to try to get the data that you're thinking I should be able to get. If in an individual's mind, the only thing to do to make that person happy is to make up the data that agrees with what they think that's what the PI wants, then now we've got a situation, right? So if that mentoring relationship is awful, if that situation is not one with open communication, there are plenty of instances where it starts with bad mentoring or it starts with a bad mentoring relationship and it does end up being research misconduct in the end. So how often does it happen? On average, probably about once a year, we end up with a finding of research misconduct. Some years it's 2 or 3. Some years I had a stretch of 1.5 years or almost 2 years where I had none at all. So again, that varies. And they really do cross the board. We've had several plagiarism cases in recent years. We've had a couple of falsification and fabrication cases as well. You know, all of those areas can be issues. In general, if you look at ORI's statistics, they're seeing a lot more instances of fabrication and falsification, oftentimes in images, you know, with Photoshop and the ability to change contrast and cut and paste and that kind of thing. A lot of altered images in published articles are really what ORI is looking at. More frequently than anything else lately. You know, something that ORI is pretty famous for saying is that as easy as it is for someone to cut and paste and create a picture that is false, that looks nice, it's that easy for ORI and others to be able to pull that back apart and to be able to tell that that's an altered image. You know, cutting out a band and putting it in place of, you know, to show a response whenever there wasn't one. If you change the tone and the lighting and all of that in that image, it almost is simple to be able to see those splicing places. And so it's really not that hard to locate an altered image if someone is specifically looking for that. All right, I'll give you a second to read this. This is my favorite cartoon. So I would certainly argue that most people aren't like Rat. And as I alluded to with the mentoring situation, I think it's more that people just lose their way. I don't think in most instances of research misconduct, generally there's not any perfectly innocent individual, but there aren't really these evil people who are just out to screw up science either. It's somewhere in between, someone who has sort of lost their way and made some decisions that probably aren't the best. I'll give you just a little bit of advice on how to make an allegation just in case you or someone else is in a situation where they need to do that. I hope not, but in the instance that someone does need to make an allegation, this is what we recommend before someone comes to see me. Documented evidence is always important. I need to be able to look at something to pursue an allegation. I am not the only person at this institution who can give guidance on this topic, and I really would argue that I probably shouldn't be the very first person to give guidance on this topic. It's always best, again, to talk with a trusted individual who knows the science in the area where the individual works. The policies are available online, both federal and local policies are available online. And it's important to understand the policies and to give a quick read through of those before someone makes an allegation. Because there are a couple of components, and two of those that I'll point out are that we call them complainants now. They used to be called whistleblowers. The person who makes an allegation of research misconduct has protections in place within the policies, federal and local, for good faith allegations. So if an individual comes to me and they are making a good faith allegation because they truly believe something is wrong, it doesn't matter if it turns out to be true that it's research misconduct in the end, but if someone is actually bringing forth an allegation because they believe that there might be something wrong, they are protected by the university in that instance. Contrast that with the fact that if someone brings a bad faith allegation, and that's essentially defined as bringing forth an allegation despite the fact that there is evidence that the individual is aware of that it's probably not true, that the allegation that they're making is not true. So a bad faith allegation, that can get the individual into some significant trouble. So the allegations need to be in good faith. And in the long run, the person who makes the allegation is not an equal party. Again, this is not a court of law. I do not have a gavel, nor does the chair of the committee have a gavel. And that also means that there's no situation where you've got the person who is accused of research misconduct here and the person who has accused that person of misconduct here, and they're in the same room and they're talking back and forth or presenting their cases at the same time. The person who makes an allegation of research misconduct, we say, thank you very much. We will get back to you. We will contact you if we need more information. And they will receive pieces of information as we go. They will know whether or not it is going to an inquiry. They will know whether or not it is going to an investigation. And they will essentially know the outcome of the investigation if we go that far. They will be interviewed at the inquiry phase and at the investigation phase. But beyond that, there is no sharing of information. So I am not required to tell anybody, and I won't tell a person who makes an allegation of research misconduct all the dirt on the situation. If I find more things, if we're looking at more information, that's not going to be something that a complainant would know about. And so they are not equal parties within the investigation. You have a question?
Yeah. Do you ever encourage resolving issues internally?
Well, the question was, do I encourage resolving issues internally? I have an obligation. So I am not anyone's advocate within the university. I am not the PI's advocate. I am not the complainant's advocate. I am not the respondent's advocate. I am the advocate of Case Western Reserve University and its ability to retain its ability to gather funds from federal agencies. That being said, if someone comes to me with a hypothetical situation, I can give advice in the hypothetical. That does not include, my necessitating follow-up. If someone comes to me and says, Dr. So-and-so, did this in this journal article, I am required to follow up on that. So in many cases, it is important for the individual to speak with someone else and get some guidance first. Because while you are required, as the policy says that it is the obligation of every person at this university to submit allegations of research misconduct when they become aware of them. Now, that doesn't mean that in certain situations, if you spoke with a trusted mentor or something like that, and they suggested a different alternative, or that it might be something else, then that's probably, that's fine. If indeed it's not clearly research misconduct, I don't believe that there's anyone at the institution who's going to completely brush something under the rug. If it's clearly a situation where misconduct very well may have occurred, I don't think any of our PIs or any of our department chairs or anyone like that would just suggest that it be brushed under the rug. But as you'll find throughout these next several days, there are so many gray areas. And those gray areas, it is up to the discretion of the individual whether they bring those gray situations to me. Does that answer your question as best I can? Okay. And that's essentially consider the alternatives. Is there a different way of dealing with this rather than making a formal allegation of research misconduct? And if there's a reasonable alternative to solving the situation, then that is acceptable. All right, enough of me just telling you about that. Let's stop for a second and say, does anyone have any other questions on the actual policy and on the way that the policy is implemented here at the institution? Okay. So let me just talk to you for a little while. This is the interesting part for the next maybe 10 or 15 minutes. I'll tell you some stories. And I'll start with my... I guess I shouldn't say my favorite story, but a story close to my heart. This is Dr. Tim Kuklo, who I worked with for a year. In my previous life, I did intraoperative neurophysiologic monitoring and I worked in St. Louis at Washington University in St. Louis for about 10 years. Every year we had at least 2 fellows who rotated through with us. I did primarily orthopedic spine surgery. So we had about 2 or 3 fellows who rotated through with us. And so every day I was in the OR with 1 of 2 people. And I spent the better part of a year in the OR with this guy. He was a lovely individual, great personality, graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, MD from UConn, JD from Georgetown, did his internship and residency at Walter Reed, did his spine fellowship at Washington University. He was an attending at Walter Reed for several years, and then he finally retired from the Army and went back to WashU as an associate professor in orthopedic surgery. Tim has on his list about 109 peer-reviewed journal articles. Incidentally, he was an orthopedic surgeon for quite some time, a trauma surgeon for some time before he decided to do a spine fellowship. So he's a lawyer. He's an MD. He's a practicing orthopedic surgeon. The Army sends him to us for some spine fellowship work. This guy was smart beyond belief and just nice. He's also a Green Beret, as it turns out. 21 invited papers, written 2 books, 37 book chapters. Out of those 109 peer-reviewed articles that he has published to his name, he got in trouble on number 106. There was an article published in 2007 in the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery, the British version of that. There's an American version and a British version. So he published this paper with several co-authors, and it was a nice article about the success of a product. It was a bone matrix product. So essentially in spine surgery, what we want the bones to do is grow together after the surgery is over. And usually they'll use crushed up cadaver bone to put in place, and then, after 6 weeks or so, that fuses together. But in place of that, there was a period of time when we were really looking, and still are, I think, I'm out of that aspect of it now, but there's still a lot of work toward, synthetic bone matrix products, so growing the bone without using cadaver bone. I think it's called Infuse, is the name of the product that he was reporting on. So this is a product made by Medtronic. Are you guys, anybody familiar with the company Medtronic? Huge, huge medical supply company. They do all sorts of different things. The defibrillators, the portable defibrillators, all kinds of different stuff. Well, they have a huge spine division, and they had this product called Infuse. So Tim published this article with this incredibly high fusion rate on trauma victims from the Iraqi war who had been treated with Infuse. And he said that Infuse was an incredibly good product, high success rate at fusing bone. And so it was a really, that's an article that's going to catch some attention from those communities that do that kind of work, either trauma or spine. So a neighbor of one of the co-authors saw him in the yard and said, "Hey, I saw your JBJS article. That was some really good work." And the co-author said, "What are you talking about?" He said, you were a co-author on this great article. So the guy looks into it and he says, "I have no idea about any of this. I was not involved in this research. I have no idea how my name got on this paper. I didn't sign. I didn't say that I wanted to be on this paper. I know nothing." And so he was also at Walter Reed. I think all of the co-authors listed were all Army docs. And so he went to the folks at Walter Reed and he said, "I don't know what's going on, but my name's on this paper and I didn't do anything." And so that started the whole process rolling. In the end, there were some other issues found. So the co-authors didn't participate. They also couldn't verify the patients. I can't remember now off the top of my head. It was over 100 patients that he said that he was looking at, and there was this like 92% success rate with the infused product. When Walter Reed started looking into this, they couldn't even verify that many patients had ever been in any clinical study with looking at this product. And there was no institutional review board protocol to review this case, or to do this research that he said he did. So by the time this occurred, Tim was already in St. Louis as an attending at WashU. And then it came out that he had received over $800,000 in funding from Medtronic. So now we've got, he included co-authors on a paper when they didn't know anything about it. So we've got a bit of an authorship issue there. So he made up patients, it appears, right? Can't verify that these patients actually existed. That's going to be misconduct. And then there's this added component, which is really becoming such a huge deal over the last 10, 20 years, is that he had received $800,000 worth of money from Medtronic, which is the company that makes Infuse, right? And that's our big buzzword. Conflict of interest is written all over this one. In the end, Medtronic dropped him like a hot potato. They're like, yeah, we knew nothing about this. We didn't tell him to write that article or anything. So he's no longer a consultant with Medtronic. He had to retract the article, obviously, because the co-authors, as it turned out, none of the co-authors knew anything. So it wasn't just that one guy. I think there were 4 or 5 folks on that paper. None of them knew anything about it. And in the long run, Kukla resigned from WashU, and I'm not sure what he's up to now. But I tell you that case because I can tell you, like I said, I worked in the OR with this guy. I worked and any of you who have ever done any work in operating rooms know that it's generally a high intensity, if people have bad behaviors, you're going to see them when they're under stress in the operating room. And I saw plenty of bad behaviors, lots of bad tempers, lots of just, less than ideal behaviors. I never saw anything. In the entire time I worked with him, I was shocked. I'm sitting here at Case with my research integrity officer hat on, and I pulled up this article and saw that it was him, and I couldn't believe it. I think I worked with probably 12 or 14 fellows out there in the time that I worked there. If I had to rank them on the people that I thought this might happen to in their lifetime, Tim would have been down there in the probably bottom 2. So this is a good guy, right? I mean, in general, he was a nice man. I don't know what happened in the years between whenever I knew him and when this all came out, but it's not a situation where, these people are just awful. Again, it's not that lie, cheat, steal idea that just runs through their heads, I think. Somehow or other, situations arise, and it seems like these things just occur. And that's, I think, one of the best things about having a class like this, is it gives you guys all opportunities to think about this stuff outside of the craziness of the 2 in the morning, what should I do? I don't know how to get myself out of this situation. Ideas. So if you can think about it in a classroom where there's no danger, there's no drama, there's no tension involved, then hopefully we get better decisions in the long run from people. So that's probably my best story. Here's another. Eric Pullman, and I'll be brief so that there's a little more time for questions. Eric Pullman is a PhD researcher. He did a lot of work. He was at the University of Vermont on he worked on menopause and hormone replacement therapy. Between 1992 and 2002, he submitted 17 federal grant applications. He published 10 journal articles. And in the long run, he was a very, very successful, a very prolific researcher and publisher, person who published a lot of articles on that whole idea of menopause and hormone replacement therapy. And if you recall, that was the time when that was That was the big push, is, hormone replacement therapy, is it okay or isn't it okay? And what he was publishing was really not very groundbreaking, so kind of different than what Kukla was doing. Kukla's stuff really garnered a lot of attention. Pullman's research was almost what you'd expect, right? That, things had progressed long enough or far enough that what he was publishing, everybody kind of probably already thought was true anyway. And so they're like, oh yeah, good, okay, he proved it, good. It wasn't like this, oh my gosh, can you believe what Pullman's results were? It just wasn't that exciting, I guess, in the long run. And it has come out that maybe that's why he got away with it for so long, is because it was just sort of what everybody expected would be the case. So in the long run, it turned out that he faked subject. He made up a bunch of subjects. He was doing a longitudinal study, so that's how it ended up involving so many grant applications and everything. So what he said was, I'm going to take these people at this point in time early on, and I'm going to do all of this testing on them. And then we're going to test them as they go through menopause and beyond, and as they have hormone replacement therapy or not, and we're going to see what happens to them over time. Problem was, he didn't have those people to begin with. So when he made his longitudinal results, he had to keep making things up because those people never existed to begin with. Some of them did, yes, and some of them didn't. Some of the ones who did exist didn't actually show results that he published. So he both made up people and he changed the results to show trends that he wanted to show, even if that wasn't the case. He destroyed evidence, he falsified documents, he really got himself into a whole bunch of trouble. And he was actually brought down by a graduate student also who worked in his lab. And there's a lot of really interesting kind of mystery novel articles that you can read about this case as well. I mean, they're very interesting. As long as it's not you who's involved in the middle of it and it doesn't affect your career or your life, they're very interesting cases to read about. But the graduate student just said, I think he was given a task of putting together some data. And he said, this doesn't work. It doesn't show what I need it to show. And so he gave it back to Pullman. And Pullman said, let me take it home for the weekend. And, maybe I just, let me just look it over again. And I'll give it back to you on Monday, and you can make the charts or the graphs and stuff. So he comes back on Monday, and voila. The data's perfect. Shows those perfect trends that he was hoping would show up and everything. And the student's like, what happened here? I don't get it. Something is just not right. And as it turned out, this went on for a very long time. And it, in the end, this all came out that there were the fake data, the changed results, and all of that kind of stuff. Some of the quotes from Pullman in the end, where he really got into trouble is he lied to the committees. So it came out, the graduate student reports him at the University of Vermont. And so he was investigated, and he had to sit through interviews with this committee, and he just flat out lied to them, told them things that just absolutely weren't true, and that's where he falsified documents associated with the investigation, and the committee was mad. And so he got into plenty of trouble as a result of that, but then when it got pushed up, these were all federally funded, and so ORI got into the picture, and they started looking at the amount of money that this guy had taken in grants, and it was, I think it was like $17 million that he had been funded, somewhere in that range. It was a ton of money. And so then ORI and the Attorney General's office got pretty involved in this, and this guy actually ended up going to jail because of the egregiousness of what he had done. He got a 166-day prison sentence. And he is debarred for life. He is never allowed to receive funding from a PHS agency forever. I think when last I heard, he was working as a middle school math teacher, I think, or science teacher in Canada. So yeah, his life has significantly changed from that famous researcher that he was not that long ago. A couple of the quotes that he has in the literature as a result of this is he said, "I believed that because the research questions were legitimate, it was okay to misrepresent minor pieces of data." So, he justified it by saying, well, I knew that the questions were good. They were legitimate questions, so it was okay to just misrepresent small pieces of the data. He said, "I saw my job in my lab as expendable if I were not able to produce." Now, he claimed that because he was a PhD working in a medical environment, that it was much easier, and he feared that the University of Vermont would just, let him go, let his whole lab go, if he weren't able to produce results. And so he felt, because he was a PhD and not an MD, that there was more risk for him, and he felt obligated. He felt obligated to his staff, he said. So he's got these graduate students who work for them. They're depending on him for their funding and their research and their degrees, and he had to keep the lab going no matter what. And then he also did admit, he said, "I cannot deny that I was also motivated by my own desire to advance as a respected scientist." And while I'm sure all of it's true, I think that's probably the biggest issue, right? The ego, I think, probably in this instance might have gotten in the way more than anything. So that's Pullman's case. He's really the only researcher who essentially only committed research misconduct. Now, there are a couple of other cases where people's misconduct caused individuals to actually die, and those folks went to jail as a result. But it wasn't exactly because of the research misconduct. They considered it to be, involuntary manslaughter or something like that, I think is what the individual that I'm thinking of went to jail for. But Pullman is the only one who actually served jail time because he defrauded the government so badly of so much money. And then let's see, I've got one other. Oh, this is the article that Professor Deming was talking about this morning. This is a really good article. Do you have that for them as a? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's a very, very good article as well. So this actually occurred at the University of Wisconsin. I wasn't sure how you were going to do your aspect of it this morning, so I don't have all of the statistics written down for this case, although you heard most of them this morning. But the individual's name, the PI who was involved in that case, is Elizabeth Goodwin, is her name. And this is what happens when someone who is found to have committed research misconduct on a PHS-funded study. This is what happens to them. So this is ORI's website, publicly available, and they have a listing here of all the people who have been found to have committed research misconduct. And you'll see I've got the big red arrow on Elizabeth Goodwin there. So then those are hyperlinks, and you can click on it, and you can find the case summary of what happened and what she was actually found to have committed research misconduct, which of the individual figures and all of that. And it talks about, on these websites, then it talks about their sanctions and what has occurred for them. The other case that I'll tell you about is this one. Just to kind of get outside of that biomedical scientific realm like the first couple were. This is the Ohio University plagiarism scandal. Is anyone familiar with that? Show of hands. Have any of you guys heard about this before? Okay, this is actually an engineering story. There was a master's student back in 2004 who was having difficulty writing his thesis in mechanical engineering. And he was looking for some ideas, and he just didn't know, his research wasn't progressing, and he needed some ideas about what to do for a project. And so he went to the library, for some exciting reading of past master's and PhD students' theses in the library at OU. And what he found was it appeared that for over 20 years, mechanical engineering students at OU were recycling the same words, essentially. Everything from word-for-word copying of entire paragraphs to, in some instances, not even doing the original work. So even, you know, some of the actual independent work that was supposed to be being done wasn't. They were just recycling aspects of other people's theses from the library. And it was blatant, apparently, and significant. This wasn't just one or two that he found a ton of these. And then he found some where they were master students and they had done this, and then they went on and had PhD dissertations that also contained the same thing. So this became a really big deal and another headline grabber, you know, in the newspapers and so forth. So there was a committee. There were probably two committees that were convened at Ohio University to review these cases, and in the long run, they revoked several degrees or indicated that they needed to. The students, they pulled them back. These people are, gone from the institution in many cases, or some of them were working on their PhD now, but their master's thesis was sitting there in the library, and they did a great deal of investigating, and they came up with kind of two levels. There were folks who had recycled words in their literature reviews and their background and methods sections, and then there were the folks who really the original technical contribution of the paper was questioned. So they had those sort of two different levels of plagiarism, and they said, you need to respond to this, tell us what happened, and then in some instances, their degrees were revoked if they didn't respond. The individual's degrees were revoked if they didn't respond to the allegation. If they did respond, then in many instances they were given about 9 months to rewrite their entire thesis or dissertation, at which point it would be reviewed and then they would make a determination as to whether or not they were going to let the person keep their degree. In addition to that, some of the faculty advisors, as best I can tell, I don't think any of the faculty advisors were fired. There may have been some instances where that actually occurred as well, but there were some significant sanctions on the faculty advisors as well, because the theory was that this really couldn't have occurred without some knowledge of some of the faculty who were involved in the process. But this was in, was that in 2006, I think? Yeah, so around, between 2005, 2006, there were lots of articles in the higher education literature and in the newspapers that really picked up on this as just a huge scandal. And this was, again, all brought about by a master's student who uncovered this while looking in the library. So, and I already showed you the Goodwin case summary, so you can look at that. That is all I have for you. There's my contact information. As I said, people are more than welcome to come and talk with me if there's an issue. I can talk with anybody about hypothetical situations and provide advice in that kind of a format, as well as accepting formal allegations of research misconduct if that's what needs to happen. Does anyone have any questions for me today? Yeah?
You kept mentioning that we might seek advice. Would you recommend doing that inside of the department, like from your advisor that's not your academic advisor, that's not your research advisor?
Well,
University ombudsman?
There is not a university ombudsman, and that's sort of unfortunate. In many instances, I think that would be the right place to go. And, if you couldn't tell from the entire presentation today, every case is unique. And so I can't say you should talk to, whomever. I think you need to look at the situation, and it's important to have someone who understands the science and the kind of research that you're doing. And you need to look at all of the political aspects of the situation that the individual is in. That might mean talking to somebody outside of the department. That might mean you can talk to another faculty member who's just not that closely involved. You obviously want to evaluate whether or not the person you're speaking with has your best interests at heart. Is there a conflict of interest? Are they more interested in wondering whether or not the grant application that they just put in is going to get funded or not, and that the person who's been accused of the misconduct is a co-author or something like that on the grant application. So all of those components really play into it. But I think it's important to choose someone who is more senior, whether that's a faculty member or a graduate student or a postdoc or whomever, someone who's got more experience in dealing with the situations than you do, and someone you absolutely trust. But talking to your wife, your husband, your mother, that person's not exactly going to be able to give you the best advice in many situations, because they've way got you in their minds, and they're probably not going to evaluate the situation as in an unbiased fashion. So, any other questions? Sure.
Is failing to file a report misconduct in and of itself?
Is failing to file a report misconduct? I have not seen that is specifically followed under the policy as an instance of misconduct. There are other issues, though. Whether or not, again, it might not be misconduct, but it might be, dereliction of duty, or, something along those kinds of lines where, we're held to lots of different standards here at the institution, and you can get in trouble if you don't. Bringing a gun to campus isn't research misconduct either, but you can't do it, right? So it's kind of like that.
And you would have signed on the grant when you accept funding and things like that you're bound by certain rules. So again, it may not be under this, but you absolutely would be held accountable on some level.
Right. And you're supposed to. Can I say that happens with 100% accuracy? Probably not. There are probably people who know of instances of things that don't seem to be right going on, but they don't report them. And as I said,
Thinking of these students who had all changed career paths and things, it would have been very easy to just say,
forget it. Right.
Well,
Right.
think about this also. Sometimes it's not a question of if someone's going to find out, it's when do they find out, which would then go back to the Ohio University, and you're like, okay, well, these people had already advanced and now their degrees are in question. So when do you want to deal with this, not if you want to deal with this?
Right. Incidentally, that ORI website has this really great thing called the lab. Actually, let me pull out, if you guys are interested in seeing more about this kind of thing. It is a really, really cool, can I pull up the internet?
I'm going to bring it up tomorrow. So
Are you? The lab
Yeah.
thing? Oh, okay, forget it.
No.
Stay tuned till tomorrow for more. I didn't know that.
No.
Sorry.
I haven't decided fully yet.
Okay.
Okay, so we have a 15-minute break if you guys can be back at 1:45. I believe restrooms are on the first floor. Grab some more